Folks, welcome into Blue Collar Bitcoin. Busy day today for Josh and I. Josh had contract negotiations for our fire department this morning. We got this right now with Yan Pritzker. And then tonight, two of us are going up to the Milwaukee Bitcoin meetup. I got to be honest with you, Joshua, I am legitimately nervous, out of my comfort zone. We may be on here talking to thousands of people a week, but talking to 30 plebs in person at a pizza parlor kind of has my butthole puckered a little bit.
You know the old saying, it's easier to shout advice from cover than to face its merit at the point of a sword. I feel like we're going to be at the point of getting slices of pizza thrown at us tonight, and I'm worried about it.
From our vantage point, it doesn't matter how many people listen. I'm still in my basement with sweatpants on and slippers. So, I don't know. You feel the same way, Jan? Like you go on a podcast, you feel like you're just chilling with people, and then you go to some conference and you're talking?
You can't see what's below the Zoom screen, right? Sometimes you're just like wearing shorts or you're naked. Like, who knows, right?
Could be anything.
Could be anything.
It's mysterious.
It's a mystery going.
We're assuming really busy week for you, Jan. Fill us in on your headspace. I'm sure we're diving into the middle of a really busy day already. What's on your mind? Take us wherever you want here off the top.
Well, I mean, I think we're all kind of looking at the banking situation that's developing. When the first thing went down, I think it was the Silvergate started happening. I basically messaged all my friends and I was like, if you have money in a non-major bank, like just make sure that you have a plan B. It was quite obvious that this was not going to be an isolated incident. I don't want to like spur any bank runs or anything. Obviously, I think, if you look at broadly, the banking system, I think is going to survive this thing. I know there's a lot of people shouting hyperinflation or that this is the end of the fiat system. I tend to be like a little bit more conservative on that side. I don't think that's the case, but I do think there's a lot of turmoil that's going to happen, and we're still seeing the tip of the iceberg. So, I mean, that's been kind of like on my mind a lot, and just in terms of how we think about money, how we think about the safety of our money and our banking. Also for companies, right? Companies were caught offsides at Silvergate, at Silicon Valley Bank, Signature, like these kinds of banks where if you were on that, if your entire banking system was Silicon Valley, you're like done for, right? You're in a big trouble. So that's something that was kind of spurring everybody to action, but also a huge week for Bitcoin as people are realizing the banking system has problems, and it's asking them, it's forcing them to ask questions, just like we saw during COVID, times when people were stuck at home and started to ask questions like, what is happening actually? And all paths lead to Bitcoin at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we appreciate about Swan is that you guys encourage people that once you've DCA'd, once your Bitcoin clears, get it off, get it in your own custody.
Yes.
Is there any concern from your end about Prime Trust at this point? Do you guys have any, because obviously that's the custodian you guys use in the interim between when the Bitcoin gets bought and when it's disseminated to your cold storage. And I'm sure Corey's obviously always vocal about who's going bust next. I'm sure he's been doing his research on them as well.
Yeah.
Assuage any concerns about that, if you would.
Yeah, I don't personally have any concerns. We know the team very well. We're, quite close with the CEO, the new CEO that came in. So we know what's going on inside and out. And one of the reasons we picked Prime Trust to begin with was because of their qualified custodian status, because they are regulated as a trust company. They can't rehypothecate your assets. They use, it's a lot of security. They have a lot of security budget, which is things that we look at, in terms of custodians, right? When you talk about, there's people out there saying, don't use a third-party custodian, build it yourself. Ultimately, somebody somewhere has keys, right? And it's at the end of the day a trust question. Whenever anybody has your Bitcoin, if it's not in your self-custody, there's an issue of trust. And when there's an issue of trust, you want to have a party that you can rely on. There's a number of factors that kind of come into play, and some of those include, how well secured is it? What's the technology look like? But also how big is the team? How good is the funding? What are the regulatory frameworks that prevent them or don't prevent them from rehypothecating or doing something weird with your assets, right? All of these things actually kind of matter. Are there audits? Are there, SOC 2 audits, which tell you that the company has been third-party audited for their, data privacy and security standards? Things like that matter, right? And that's why we chose Prime Trust. We are diversifying our custodian base, so we will be using other qualified custodians as well. That's something that we started last year. That project obviously got accelerated with the loss of Texas. So Prime Trust pulled out of Texas. We believe they're going to be back. but we want to make sure that we have good coverage there.
Right.
From the standpoint of like, trusting them with Bitcoin, most of our users withdraw the Bitcoin. We have, I think 64% is the number that I last looked at as far as the number of Bitcoin that is withdrawn on a daily basis. So we have ongoing daily proof that the Bitcoin is there, right? So a lot of people will say, how do you know, if you buy a number on a screen, how do you know you have any Bitcoin?
Right.
And the only answer that you could possibly have is you have to be able to withdraw it. If you talk about something like proof of reserves, that's kind of bogus. You can easily fake it. You can have liabilities that outweigh your reserves. That's not something that really tells you the Bitcoin is there. The only thing that tells you is if you withdraw it. And our users withdraw it. That's how we know it's there.
To break it down, just so that it's very simple for people to understand, the structure of prime trust is very different from a bank. Whereas they can't rehypothecate, they can't fractional reserve.
Correct.
As Silvergate did, even though it seems from what I understand, Silvergate was very well capitalized. They've basically had a run on them for months before they finally capitulated.
Yep.
Whereas I think it was like 85% reserves they held, which is incredibly high for a bank. That was atypical for sure. And I think it was because of the environment they were in, with crypto obviously being extremely volatile. They had good risk management, but just not quite good enough.
That's right. And it's actually, ironically, it's a problem that you can face in dollars more so than you can face in crypto or Bitcoin, right? Because even with something like Prime Trust, they are a trust company, which means by regulation, they cannot take your assets and rehypothecate them, loan them out. They have to keep them segregated from their own assets. So that means if they're, going out of business, then your assets are still legally in your title. However, they have dollars and they have crypto. Now, we only care about Bitcoin, but let's be honest, they do deal with other cryptos. So their digital assets or their crypto or their Bitcoin, right, is there, right? It's one-to-one. It's not backed. It's just literally there. So you could just withdraw it. The dollars, however, since dollars are a fictional construction, of the government, they're not really there. They're in banks, right? And when they're in banks, they're only there to the extent that the government will, backstop them with FDIC or otherwise. So, ironically, it's the dollars that are not safe. It's not the Bitcoin. Like the Bitcoin is there. The dollars are only there insofar as the government will allow them to be there in the case of a bank failure.
The thing that's crazy about this week, and we're very careful on the show, Yan, of taking snapshots of 1 week, but I'm going to go ahead and contradict that and do it anyways. It is bizarre to see fear and illiquidity lead to a pump in Bitcoin. And it kind of makes the hairs stand up on the back of your neck because you realize what the implications of that could be at a larger scale or a longer time frame. Why the pump, I guess, is the first question. And do you think there's any staying power into it? Do you think the narrative's kind of flipping of people recognizing how just massively fragile the global financial system is, and they're starting to see this for the anti-fragile rock? Or is this just kind of a blip on the radar? What's your thought there?
It's really hard to say, but my guess is that it's a little bit of everything. One of the things that we saw during the banking crisis was, and we did it internally as Swan, is we started thinking, okay, where is our dollars? Where are our dollars? And what should we do about that, right? Are they safe in where they are? Should we diversify in our banking relationships? One of the decisions we made, and we at Swan, we keep a Bitcoin treasury. We said, we're actually going to front run some of our purchasing that we usually do as far as our Bitcoin treasury. We're actually going to do that earlier because that gets us out of dollars and into Bitcoin at a time where there's tons of uncertainty in the banking system, right? And I saw this on Twitter. I know it anecdotally from our own calculations, and I know it from other companies saying so. Everybody was making the same calculation. They were all saying, they were all starting to weigh whether or not Bitcoin belonged on their balance sheet. Now, a lot of the companies in the space that already had Bitcoin treasuries, they were already practiced in this. They already had relationships with, Swan or other companies where they could buy for their Bitcoin treasury. They just executed on that. They started buying Bitcoin, right? We saw it from our customers. We did it ourselves. We heard it on Twitter. So I think that's a substantial part of what was going on, is that you saw larger, high net worth people, companies, things like that, start to really diversify their holdings, especially if they were in a bank that was maybe a smaller bank. Maybe they had balances over 250K. So they were exposed to potentially a bank failure. I think that's one thing. And a part of me is I wish that was the entire story, is people just being smart and understanding Bitcoin and this is the Renaissance, right? Everybody's just going to do this now. But I think there's also, of course, like the narrative and the pump aspect of it is as soon as that starts happening, everybody else jumps on board and they're like, okay, Bitcoin's pumping. Well, we're just going to buy some just because it's pumping. That's just the normal hype cycle that you get. So you get amplification, right? And it gets into the media. We're seeing it in the news now. We're seeing, a lot of people talk about how Bitcoin's outperforming every other asset in the middle of this crazy, bank crisis. That's definitely a story, right? And I think a lot of people with money and who can capitalize on that story can use it to pump, right? Like we have, Balaji out there going out and saying Bitcoin's going to hit 1 million in 90 days. Like, do any of us honestly believe that? I mean, I don't personally, but maybe some people do. And I think it's for him, it's a smart move. It's a smart marketing move, right? To go and start pumping Bitcoin at a time when it's already being pumped. And it's like, you just pile on, right? So I think it's a combination of yes, people are waking up, and yes, they're learning, and yes, they're doing this for rational reasons. And then there's also just, hey, let's just ride the wave and pump the hell out of this thing.
We're going to take a quick break here to remind you folks to get your Bitcoin 2023 tickets. The Bitcoin conference hosted by Bitcoin Magazine is going down once again in Miami Beach, May 18th to the 20th, 2023. Josh and myself, Dan, will be there. And if you're dead serious about Bitcoin or interested in learning more, you should be there too. Join the two of us for the world's largest gathering of Bitcoiners as we celebrate yet another year of progress towards hyper-Bitcoinization. It's going to be a signal-packed party with a smorgasbord of outstanding Bitcoin education and access, and you can get 10% off tickets with code BCB23. That's BCB23 for 10% off. Ticket prices will go up significantly and incrementally from now until the conference. So get on it, folks. Right. I was listening to Saifedean and Sailor this morning on Twitter Spaces, and Saif was saying that he thinks there's a chance Balaji really just fully grokked Bitcoin last week, and he basically drew the parallel to every single ardent Bitcoiner that exists and is listening right now, where when this thing does click, no matter what year or date or time or place, you go crazy. You go manic in the short term, and you realize how magnificently positioned this technology is given this global macro environment, and you just prematurely ejaculate everywhere. You start talking to everyone in your inner circle, and you think that it's just going to happen in the next month or two. He thinks that's maybe what happened to Balaji.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, look, the guy's got like a crypto bro podcast going on with interviewing Vitalik. I mean, it's not. He's been in this space for a long enough time. I think he actually understands Bitcoin very well. I just think he's a very good marketer, and he wants to capitalize on his marketing skills.
And this looks like a brilliant move in that regard.
Yes.
And those aha moments that you just described, because I remember having that one with Bitcoin in like 2017 when it really clicked. I miss that so much. When you have this new, whatever rabbit hole you go down, when you get that aha moment, that's one of those moments that I really treasure. You don't get them very often, especially it seems like they're less frequent as you get older. Unfortunately,
Jan, you tweeted this week an Andreas Antonopoulos talk from, I think, 2016, something about global currency wars and Bitcoin's neutrality, and you said that that's the resource that really orange-pilled you. Andreas, like tons of people, this isn't some unique statement. He really is the one responsible for orange-pilling the two of us. His Internet of Money 1 is what Josh introduced me to Bitcoin, and that was the first book I read.
Nice.
And that sunk its teeth into me, and I think maybe that talk is in the Internet of Money 1, if I remember correctly. But it's an incredible talk.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I actually never ended up reading that book, but I watched almost every one of his videos at the time, like in 2016, 2017.
Amazing videos.
And really good stuff. It's kind of sad that he kind of went down the blockchain crypto bro route for some reason, because he was one of the first people that opened my eyes to the idea that Bitcoin is not a technology thing. And he even said so. He's like, it's not a payment network. It's not a technology. It is a new form of money, and it's changing the relationship that people have with their money and their state. And he was that's why the Currency Wars video is so powerful, because he's going through all these examples of stuff that was going on in 2013, I think was around the time of like the Greek and Cypriot banking crises and all that kind of stuff. And he was basically saying, look, this problem that happened in 2013 didn't go away. We're continuing to have these currency crises all over the world. It's happening now, and this was now in 2016, but now in 2023, it's still continuing to happen, right? You still have capital controls in Argentina. You can't buy like more than $300 worth of dollars or something like that, and with crazy taxes, right? So this stuff is happening all the time. We have currency controls, and we have governments competing with each other to devalue their currencies, and that's the kind of stuff he was talking about there. And in 2016, that's when I woke up and said, wait a minute, because I got into Bitcoin or, broadly crypto in 2016 because of Ethereum. Like I got in because I was like, oh, this is a cool decentralized blockchain. We're going to like decentralize all the things, build banking applications on the blockchain. Like I bought into that whole meme because I was a developer, and I started like looking at that. And then I watched this video and I was like, oh my God, this is not what I thought. It's actually a whole new type of money. It's going to bring freedom and self-sovereignty to people. It's like a huge deal. So that video is a must watch, I think.
Every one of these impulses, the first one that really got my attention, probably because I was just old enough to really understand finance a little bit, the great financial crisis, followed by what you described in Europe, in Greece, the bank bail-ins. Then we saw 2020, and now these bank runs. Each one of these impulses seems to grab another cohort of people, and mostly people that are in traditional finance because they're kind of up front with the front row seats seeing it happen. The interesting thing about in the last week, and this just happened, so it's top of mind, is the way Credit Suisse blew up and the way the bondholders are getting completely fucked and the equity holders are still getting a piece, even though it's a percentage, they're still getting something. That is completely the antithesis of how the capital structure is supposed to work. Bondholders are traditionally supposed to be the front to the trough. They're supposed to be the hogs that get at least less leaned than the rest of all the way down to the bottom of the capital stack where the equity holders are supposed to starve. That kind of thing happening in the bond market, which is mostly consisting of traditional, high mind finance, whatever. I tend to think myself that when they watch these things happen, that's an orange pill delivered right to them when they understand this counterparty risk. And there's also legal risk. Like this might take years to go through, to get finally paid out in the inflating currency that they're going to, those euros are going to be worth less 5 years from now when they get their payout from this thing.
Substantially less, most likely.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on this thing just accelerating and orange pilling more people all on its own? Like this, and especially the bondholder situation.
I think in general, not just Credit Suisse, and I'm going to preface this with saying, like, I'm not a financial person. Everything I know about finance, I learned from Bitcoin, which is kind of interesting because I come at it with beginner's mind. I never even took like a macro econ class in college, right? I came in with no understanding of money, no understanding of finance, good understanding of technology. I've been doing tech for 20 years. I have really good understanding of how the distributed systems and how the tech behind Bitcoin works. And then I started learning about everything that's going on in the financial space. And with beginner's mind, you come at it and you're like, okay, supply and demand. I understand it. Like when you make more of something, it like goes down in value because, there's too much of it. And so each individual unit is worth less. It seems like a child can understand this, right? Mm-hmm. And yet you then get people in the, let's call it the not banking, but central banking, the government that try to like pull the wool over your eyes and tell you that none of these things are real. Like supply and demand somehow magically breaks. Inflation is quote unquote complicated. It's not like, if we just print a lot of money, like it's not going to cause inflation, right? And you sit there like with a beginner's mind and you say, what? how can that possibly be true?
Yeah, it's like a baffle with bullshit type of mentality,
like, and they're like, look at all these levers and switches and, it's a Rube Goldberg machine. You can't really predict.
You just can't understand it. You just have to trust us. We'll figure it out for you.
Yeah, and it turns out they don't understand, right? And you see, or maybe they do. I don't know what where you are on the conspiracy theory spectrum, but it seems like every time the Fed acts, they're like,
daily.
they aren't, like you read Parker Lewis. He's got a great paper, Ender's Game, where he talks about how the Fed during the great financial crisis, completely was asleep at the wheel, right? And you see it again right now, right? Either they're asleep at the wheel, or they, or they're. Again, it's like the conspiracy theory
thing.
It's
funny you say sleep at the wheel. I was just listening to Caitlin Long with Pete McCormick, and she was like, I know it was Powell or whoever was in charge of the FDIC, basically said 2 days before the bank runs that we've never seen a bank run in,
right.
I forget the exact quote, but he's basically like, we've never seen a bank run since, 19 whatever. And then it happens 2 days after he makes the statement. So clearly they didn't see it coming whatsoever. It was a surprise if you say that 2 days before it happens.
The other thing, go ahead, Jan.
I was going to say my point, I guess, broadly is that we're seeing that when people meddle, so the financial system is an extremely complicated, it is true, it's very complicated. There's a lot of moving things, a lot of moving pieces, a lot of second, third order, N order effects to any little change in it, right? And then you have people with like this like really broad lever, like, okay, we can increase bank reserves, decrease bank reserves. We can, we can do QE or not, right? They're really, really not like fine instruments, right? And they make one big macro change. They're repricing risk, they're repricing money broadly, and then all of a sudden you have like these extremely like 10, 12th order effects downstream of that, right? That they cannot possibly predict. Like no AI in the world is going to be able to predict that. So, I think what we're learning and what people are learning is that when humans meddle in complex systems, they generally fuck them up. That's kind of like the idea, because they have this illusion that they understand the ramifications and the second or 10 order effects of what they're doing, but they don't. There's no possible way they can. So I think that is an orange pilling moment, and I think if you look at it, your choice A is like, okay, yeah, just trust us, bro, the Fed, we're going to fix everything, or we'll break it and then we'll fix it, and then we'll break it again. Or you kind of say, okay, well, humans should not be part of this equation. Like,
right.
You need a fixed and simple to understand system. That's Bitcoin. You have a fixed monetary policy. I know that one unit is one unit. It's not going to change. And then I can actually build a financial system on top of something that is constant and not being meddled with.
What you said is so important. And I think the key is decentralization, not only with Bitcoin, but decentralization with markets in general, because as you stated, there's nobody that has a brain that is, nobody's intelligent enough to make decisions and think of the third, fourth order effects. So this decentralization idea, which is what markets are, which is what evolution is, which is what all these things coalesce back into, is that there is nobody pulling the levers because the levers pull themselves. You have to let the invisible hand that Adam Smith talked about, 300 years ago, or however long it was ago he wrote that book. You have to let the invisible hand do its job. And I think this dovetails perfectly into something else we want to talk to you about, which is your experience in the Soviet Union. I know you grew up there. I don't know exactly how old you were when you left or how much of it you remember or how acutely you remember it, but I'd be curious for you to talk a little bit about what that experience was like and how maybe you would approach explaining to someone who's woke today, who wants to see socialism or communism, and what would be your response to those people as to why this may not be the thing they think it is.
I came to the U.S. when I was 7. So, like, if I have to be completely honest, I know a lot of this through my parents and a lot of it through research. I remember some of it, but most of it is kind of from my parents and from research. So my orange pilling story is actually partially Andreas Antonopoulos, but secondarily, it's talking to my parents after I watched that video. Because after I watched that video where he said there's capital controls in all these countries and people, are limited to how much they can take out of the ATM, how much they can travel outside the country with, and so on, that kind of like lit a light bulb for me, because I started thinking, okay, well, I know that when we came to America, we were very poor. I know that we started very poor, but like, why is that, right? And so I asked my parents, like, I know that we left with like a handful of suitcases. Basically what they said to me is took like, 4 suitcases or whatever, and $400, because the Soviet government actually had capital controls in 1989 where people were starting, that's when I left, people were starting to be let out of the country. And by the way, there was, talking about COVID lockdowns, you couldn't leave the Soviet Union without the government's permission, right? For decades, not like 2 years. So that was the environment. There was extreme censorship of information. So you didn't really get any exposure to like what the West was like. There was a small number of people that were able to go out and take business trips. My grandpa, actually, he was an aviation engineer. He was engineering hangars for airplanes, and he's like a big time patent holder. He's like a pretty giga brain kind of guy. He got to travel to the U.S. actually quite early, I think in the late 80s. And, so he came back and he knew a little bit what the West was like, even though when they traveled here, I'm sure they were somewhat sheltered and so on. But a few people had gotten glimpses of the West, but most of the Soviet Union just had no idea that there was like abundance anywhere in the world, right? Like we lived in, you stood in a line and you didn't know what they were giving that day, but you stood in the line anyway. Whatever you got, and you bartered for whatever you needed. So bread lines, milk lines, clothing. Yeah. If you wanted jeans, like that's a month's worth of salary on the black market. Like that's a $200, $300, or 200, 300 rubles or something like that, which was like the monthly salary for an engineer. Like that's your pair of jeans, right? Because they were just impossible to get. So on the other hand, you could get an apartment for free, but it took 20 years to get one. So my parents actually divorced on paper so that they could be in 2 separate waiting lines for apartments. So they were in 2 separate queues because they divorced on paper. So like that kind of stuff, it was like a completely broken economy, right? And on top of that, there was capital controls for any sort of exit. So even when they did open up the borders in '89, they only allowed people to leave with $100. Or there was, to more accurately, there was a government exchange rate, which was like, say, I think 8 rubles to a dollar, and then there was the street exchange rate, which was like 30 or 40 rubles to a dollar. So the government exchange rate, which nobody believed in, right? That was how you could get your money out, and so you could get $100, and the rest of your rubles were worthless. They were toilet paper. So basically, we left with $400, and that to me was kind of my orange pilling story, because I started understanding that the stuff that Andreas was talking about in terms of currency controls and capital controls and price manipulation, right? The Soviet government fixed prices of goods, it fixed salaries across different tiers, like all engineers were paid X, right? It was the same. Because they had manipulated the economy so completely, the whole thing didn't work anymore. The communication of prices is very vital for an economy. Like, you need to know if I need to make more of it, less of it. Right. That was broken in the Soviet Union. So it was planned by the government. How many potatoes do we need to produce? How many buildings do we need to build? Everything was planned. So therefore, it didn't work. So for me, like, that was the moment where I just realized, okay, we need a free market money that things to be priced in accurately, A, and B, we need to be able to take that money with us. It needs to be portable. It needs to be actually yours. And so if your country is not good and your government is not good, and you have some ability to leave that country and that environment, then you want to be able to take your wealth with you.
I know there's maybe a generational gap, but based on your experience, does Bitcoin tend to rather quickly for those that lived through something like the Soviet era?
I think so. I mean, for my parents, it was very quick, like when I explained it. And to be fair, my dad is also, in the software industry. So he kind of started thinking about it as a distributed system first, similar to me. And then I kind of explained, hey, if we had this in the Soviet Union, we would have been able to take it with us. They got it pretty quick. I do think there's an age thing here. It's harder for people, who didn't live through that environment, but it's just simply like, let's say, boomers in the U.S. They have seen some fluctuations in currency and interest rates and stuff like that, but they've never really experienced true capital controls in a sense. It's harder for them. Yeah, it's easier for immigrants who've had to pick up and leave everything because they understand the value of being portable with your wealth. Whereas, people who have never had to leave their country kind of don't think about that, or don't ever think, especially if you're in the U.S., because you think, oh, U.S. is fine, is the freest, best country in the world, rah, 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 we're never going to have to leave here. You don't really think about it. But immigrants, they know.
I think we got just a little taste of that here in the last few years. Like, I remember reading, or just different books I've read about the Nazis and all the horrors that happened over there. And you think to yourself, like, how does a society go from functional to so dysfunctional that the genocide is going on, or any of the other horrible things that happen in any country in the world? And then we got this front row seat to how society kind of loses its own mind right in front of us in the last couple of years. And we only got a small taste of what it must be like to be in some of those dystopian places. But it was almost like an infection that spread over. We had 2 infections going on at once. We had COVID-19, which turned out to be a nothing burger overall. And we had this psychotic break that society seemed to have about forcing other people to do things whether or not they wanted to, and how quickly I just saw how quickly that rabbit hole can devolve into really ravenous, crazy people that could do and say things that would have never dreamed they would do 2 years ago.
Yeah, and plus you have the social media amplification of crazies, right? Because it might be like a small proportion of crazies, but they're so loud and so amplified that it creates the perception that like society is completely like breaking at the seams. Right. There is some of that, but I think it also might be a little bit overblown. You step outside here, Glenview, like everything's fine. So
I still see someone driving their car with a mask on by themselves. And
it does happen.
It's funny.
This is insane.
Yeah, and we kind of got a front row seat to the whole gamut of COVID as medics because, we did see the people with COVID. Like, to be fair to both sides, we emptied some nursing homes and saw some people in some severe respiratory stress that needed a lot of interventions. But what we saw far more of is people absolutely losing their minds, freaking out, anxiety attacks over COVID. And you're sitting there as a paramedic, sizing up just your experience in one medium-sized suburb, saying, if you're this terrified of COVID, you've lost the plot. You need to be much more concerned about diabetes and heart disease and strokes, and the list could go on and on. So we got the front row seat to COVID-19 and the impacts of that virus. And we also got the front row seat to the impacts of societal delusion and just rampant anxiety at a level. I've only been doing this for 7 years, but Josh, I'm sure you would agree. It went through the goddamn roof. And it feels like we're still coming down from it.
Yeah, the psych calls multiplied by a factor of 2 to 3, I would say. Minimum.
It's crazy.
We're constantly on them. Dan and myself, Josh, talk a lot on this show about running a Bitcoin node. If you are a serious Bitcoiner and you want to verify, not trust, you will take this step at some point. For our node setups, we run software and hardware from Start9 Labs. This setup enables us to run a reliable and secure Bitcoin node, but then, if we so choose, experiment and graduate way beyond that towards many different areas of sovereign computing. You can download Embassy OS for free and install it on your own hardware, or you can buy one of Start9's plug-and-play devices. We highly recommend these devices. Start9 builds reliable and extremely easy-to-use products backed up with incredible customer support. Run a Bitcoin node, run a Lightning node, run a NOSTR relay. Take control of your photos, messages, passwords, pictures, and data, all on one device. Embassy OS operating system is the distribution platform open source software has been waiting for. Visit start9.com. We only recommend and endorse companies that we believe in, and Swan Bitcoin is a company we believe in. I have been personally using Swan to DCA into Bitcoin since May of 2020, when Bitcoin was the wee price of $9,500. Swan's interface and on-ramp is incredibly simple and user-friendly. With Swan, you can dollar cost average daily, weekly, or monthly, or conduct a smash instant buy whenever you want. Withdrawals to cold storage are completely free and can be totally automated, truly set and forget. Swan wants you to hold your Bitcoin keys, and support is one click or phone call away if you need help during this process. Buying Bitcoin is just the tip of the iceberg. Swan also has a Bitcoin IRA product, business and nonprofit offerings, resources for financial advisors, private services for high net worth clients, and phenomenal educational materials. Visit swan.com for more information. And at swan.com/fire, you can learn about and receive Swan Premium for 1 year.
The one thing I wanted to double back to that I just wrote down these 4 hedges that Bitcoin is in different people's mind. And you hinted earlier in the episode, Yan, at the fact that coming in with an outside perspective can be very helpful in sizing up economics and finance in general. I think through my own journey, and I think Josh will attest to this, I wasn't like you. I was not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I had a fundamental understanding of kind of finance and economics from like college level courses, right? And I was sort of on your traditional DCA into diversified equity strategy, free up your that sort of lens. And I think for that reason, it was harder for this to click for me. A, because I'm in maybe the most privileged country in the world, and even though the pond I'm swimming in is muddy, it's much clearer than the rest of the world. And so you watch these like progressions that people go through, like a bond trader initially may start thinking about this as a hedge against fixed income. Then maybe the next tier down is like, oh, maybe this is a hedge against fiat and dollars in general. The next layer down is like, and we're starting to see this last couple of weeks, oh, this is a hedge against the foundational plumbing of the financial system, like banking. But when you went through the Soviet Union, you're one layer of inception further down, which is, no, this is a hedge against autocratic centralized control in general. And so it meets different people at the different levels they're at. And for everyone, it's some form of a hedge. But I think it's most dramatic. Maybe it clicks or could click the most dramatically for someone that lives in Soviet Russia or Argentina or Venezuela or China or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Or even someone who's more predisposed to conspiracy theories and has way less trust in authority than the average plebe does.
Yeah. Like Josh.
Like me.
You should.
That's
all
why
authority leads
Josh was like, Dan, Josh basically just kept knocking at my door like, Dan, you're smarter than this. Like you need to crack out of it. You need to see this.
I mean, what ended up, it was exactly what you just described, which is like I think your baseline for like here's the bottom line. Dan never got arrested when he was like 16, 17 years old. So he didn't have that automatic, like just hate for authority that I automatically had. So this was like, oh shit, this is going to disintermediate any kind of authority. I love it. Right off the bat.
One question I have is I've heard you talk some. I heard you talk with McCormick, Yan, about sort of Bitcoin's potential impact on societal organization in general. Like, here's a quote I wrote down of yours, is that Bitcoin could prevent the next Soviet Union. What are your thoughts there? Maybe both sides of that equation. Yeah, it's a decentralized free protocol, but we're still limited by being, flesh and bone. How much of an impact do you think this could really have on broad societal organization? I know that's a big question, but I feel you may be the guy to ask it.
Yeah, I mean, I try to think of it like kind of piece by piece, right? Building up a case for that idea. Obviously, you have to start with like the obvious thing. If there are people with guns that prevent you from leaving, like that's it, full stop, right? Like, doesn't matter how good your Bitcoin is and if you've memorized your seed phrase. Like, if there's somebody at the border that will like put a gun to you and say, sorry, you can't leave, you're kind of screwed, right? So I think we have to start from there and understand that that's what the Soviet Union was. They would not let you leave. It doesn't matter, anything else, right? They just would not let you leave. So that is a problem that Bitcoin does not solve. However, I think that Bitcoin can potentially transform society in a way where that problem doesn't happen, right? Because how did we get there? How did that occur? How do we get to a point where the government's like so powerful where they can actually just stop you from leaving? And it's a combination of things. I mean, it's a combination of a power imbalance where, the government was able to like, they have the military, they have the weapons and so on and so forth. And revolution isn't really practical. But it's also just like the shape of society. Society, in large part, just acquiesced and was like, okay, yes, this is the way things are. We're going to let the government plan everything. And, if you think about like where the Soviet Union came from, it came from a utopian idea that, the plebs revolted in a sense. It wasn't really the plebs. It was like, let's say it's the intellectuals. But let's just say the intellectuals revolted on behalf of the plebs against, the Tsar and said, okay, obviously a king is a bad, autocratic leader. We're just going to make everything really egalitarian, and we're going to make sure that the resources are well distributed and so on. And so that idea, that kind of mind virus that if only we put the people in charge who really care about everybody, they're going to make sure everything is fair. That's what led to the Soviet Union, right? So the first idea was that there was some support. There was popular support for this idea that okay, we got to stop the king from being in charge, and we're going to distribute everything, and that led to that creation of a society where people basically trusted the government, and then the government basically, abused that trust, enriched themselves, made everybody poor, broke the economic system, right? And everything just disintegrated from there. When I look at Bitcoin, I think, okay, this is something that people can start to build their own, I call it, build your stash of freedom cash. You have your stash. Nobody can touch it. Okay, let's assume that you're in an environment like the United States where it hasn't yet gotten to that point. It hasn't gotten to the point where you can't leave. It hasn't gotten to the point where, there's extreme top-down control. There's some, obviously. We do have a very large and powerful government, but by and large, we're free, especially compared to most, places in the world.
Yes.
So you're very privileged to live in such a society compared to, like, say, China or something, right? Very privileged. You have the ability to buy Bitcoin today. Okay, why aren't you buying it? Get some Bitcoin, right? Now you have this little option stash. Now you see, okay, now the government's doing something weird. Okay, they're taking control of the banking system in the name of rescuing it or whatever, nationalizing the banking system, let's say, and and then they're introducing a CBDC, central bank digital currency, and now they're controlling how you can spend your money. Okay, warning flags should go off at this point, right? You should be like, okay, why is this happening? Why can't I spend my money on eggs? I can only spend it on bread today. This seems like a bad idea. But guess what? I have got my Bitcoin. So, and they're still letting me leave, and I'm going to leave, right? And so now you have that option. Now, if you think of it like an aggregate, you get brain drain, right? You get people who are smart enough to understand what's happening, have the pot of freedom cash, and can leave, and they start to leave, right? And so now those people are leaving, and they're going to hopefully a better jurisdiction, enriching that country with their intellectual wealth and entrepreneurship and all that. And then you've got the other country kind of suffering because they've done they've implemented bad policies. So that in and of itself could shape society. It's not going to prevent the people from, stopping you with guns, but you want to try to prevent, you don't want to get to that point. That's the idea that I have there.
We kind of have a microcosm of that going on in the United States right now. California being the primary one losing on that end. Like, people are just pouring out of there, and they're talking about now a wealth tax for exiting and stuff, which is all crazy, and it's just going to incentivize
California
people
wants to tax you forever on your income.
Exactly. The thing about Bitcoin is that it doesn't change human nature in any way, but it harnesses and incentivizes people to use their human nature to do, and not necessarily good, but economically good, which is what market prices do. They economically, I mean, they incentivize you by greed to go out there and buy what you want, but by buying what you want, you know, you signal the market to produce what you want, and it's all very decentralized and it works really well. On this topic, again, like Dan and I are constantly trying to orange pill people, and you always run into road stops. Your book is actually, I'm going to credit you. I was reading it last night again for probably the third time. I don't think I ever quite understood some of the difficulty adjustment stuff totally, but I think you finally knocked it into my thick skull, and I finally totally understand how it is that works. But anyway, I'm kind of going off topic here. What is your go-to narrative to try to introduce someone to the idea of Bitcoin to help them understand this thing from its inception?
Well, I have to be like pretty targeted with it. I think, you know, I interact a lot with immigrants. Like my friends are all Soviet immigrants or similar. So for them, the pitch is pretty much, you know, hey, it's like if you need to leave again, here's how you do it, right? That's a very, like, it's an easier pitch for those folks, like I said. I think for the broader sort of American public, I think one of the things that we need to look at, and one of the things that I've been pointing to, is look at the change in our society around how we transact with money specifically. Let's not even talk about freedom of speech or other things that might be going on, but like, how do we transact with money? And used to be, you know, I could go to the store and just pay with cash, and now every single transaction is going over some sort of digital medium, you know, PayPal or Venmo or Cash App or whatever, Visa, you know, Apple Pay. Those are all digital mediums. So it's very easy for somebody to just click a button and stop that from happening at any point, right? It could happen at any point. And I think censorship of money then leads to censorship of speech, because if I can't then, you know, if I say something bad, I can't buy a train ticket, you can point to China and explain how that's already happening in China. That is the thing that worries me the most, and the thing that I try to explain to people without sounding like you don't want to go like all full tinfoil hat and like doomer right away, because that also puts people off, right? You need to be like, look, we're trying to prevent sort of this dystopian future, but we're actually just trying to build something better. You know, we have a society that's pretty free, pretty good, but this is the direction it's going in. It's going in the direction of less freedom, and here's the thing that could actually go in the direction of more freedom. Right. And so I think you have to have that little bit of optionality to build in that direction, both for your own protection, but also like just to contribute to the greater good. Like that's why I do Bitcoin. Right. I think that Bitcoin is this thing that could free a lot of societies across the world. Like I want to contribute to it. I buy it for myself out of greed, but also out of altruism, because I think it's going to enrich me, but it's also at the same time supporting the Bitcoin network. I run my node. I buy my Bitcoin. I raise the price. It supports Bitcoin worldwide. It supports freedom movements worldwide. So it really depends on the audience you talk to. Like if I talk to, you know, liberals and things like that, I look at all these freedom movements that Bitcoin's been able to support across the world. Like these people in Nigeria or Belarus who've been like suppressed by their government. They can't, you know, speak out. They're using Bitcoin to raise money and to do their freedom movement. So you have to like shape that narrative depending on the audience.
100%. I think some people feel like when you cling on to a narrative that only gets one side of Bitcoin, you're taking a shortcut. I totally disagree. Meet people where they're at. Maybe this week or this month, Bitcoin's a better bank, whatever it is. But the point, like, you know, we say here, Bitcoin is simultaneously super simple yet tremendously complex. And that latter part often comes through to bring back premature Bitcoiner ejaculation on no coiners. We just go absolutely bananas. We got to keep this simple and approachable because it's a ton to take in. And I think the other thing some of us Bitcoiners forget is like our passion is not going to be everyone else's passion, right? One of the things we're hammering home here is that this should be money made simple. This should be your average wage earner's ability to preserve buying power into the future. And the average wage earner doesn't have hundreds of hours to study macroeconomics and Bitcoin and all that stuff. So you have to make simple, digestible, both educational materials, but also suggestions on how they approach this. And that can be different things for different people. But a lot of times people are looking for the answer. Yeah, you have to push them to go learn, but they also want to hear you say, buy on Swan, buy a cold card single sig, back it up on metal, They want to hear the answer because they're not going to dedicate the 300 hours that you did because this is your great life passion. You know, no matter how far along 100%. The line is, you got to bring this back and make it relatable. It's hard.
Yeah. Though. Yeah. And the other day, true story, I was selling something on Facebook. A lady came over to buy this thing. It was my monitor or whatever. I don't know if she's listening to this podcast. It'll be amazing if she is. She came in. I was selling her the monitor, and then, you know, we got to talking, whatever. I said, you know, I run a Bitcoin company. And she said, Bitcoin, it's like a bunch of fake numbers on a screen, isn't it? I'm like, well, you know, it's worth about, you know, it's been worth about $1 trillion. Now it's a little bit less than $1 trillion. So a lot of people disagree. It's something very valuable for the world, and, you know, it's helping out in a lot of, you know, countries across the world where we might not see those problems, but those countries see them. And she's like, oh, really? And I was like, yeah. Like, you know, Lebanon, Iran, you know, Turkey, whatever. I went through the list of countries with inflation problems and where Bitcoin's being uptaken. And she's like, oh, I have, you know, my sister-in-law or something is from Lebanon, and I heard they're having problems getting their money out of the bank. I'm like, yes, that's what I'm talking about. Like, if she has Bitcoin, like, and she's like, well, what is she supposed to do? I'm like, well, now it's too late. Her money's stuck in the banking system. Some people in Lebanon bought Bitcoin ahead of time. You know, this was the time to do it. It's like, you don't want to wait until the crisis. You have to actually do it before the crisis hits, because when the crisis is there, it's too late. Can't get your money, can't get out. Done. And so she came away with, and I gave her my book and everything, sent her home. So we'll see. But she came away from like literally 10-minute conversation around Bitcoin is completely fake to, oh, I see how it could possibly help, you know, my sister-in-law. You have to find that thing. Each person has something where Bitcoin is going to solve their problem, but you need to connect with it. And the thing is, for people like us who do study it for 300 hours or 3,000 hours, we probably know all 3,000 answers. But it's up to us to identify that person's problem, because Bitcoin does actually, the meme is Bitcoin fixes this. It really does fix a lot of things. You've got to find that connection.
I think most people are so fixated on the angle that they see it from, the lens that they see the world, that it makes it really hard for them to empathize with the way that it has to be structured for that other person. And obviously you nailed that one. But that's something to keep in mind when you are orange billing people. Like, try to keep your radar up for what it is that will, what is it that's going to move them, and try to structure it in the way that will.
Yeah. And some
engage in some foreplay is what we're saying, you know.
Yes.
Some heavy pettings, you know, some light kissing, some heavy petting.
Flirting.
Yeah,
not exactly. Dan just starts with
you got to feel it out. You got to feel it out what they're into. Like, what are they into? Are they into, like, you know, inflation? Are they into, like, you know, what's their thing?
Exactly. What's their fetish? And then, you know, leverage that from there.
This we were at the firehouse the other night. This is way out of left field. I'm just warning you guys right out of.
Love it.
We're watching. For some reason, we decided to watch this documentary about the Unabomber, and so we're watching this thing. Timothy McVeigh, he's an interesting character. Like, he long and on the '60s, he realized, like, oh shit, this technology that we're working on could lead to a very dystopian future. And he was a very smart dude, obviously. So he decided the way that he's going to fix this problem is by blowing up anybody that was working on technology. Wow. If only he had survived long enough, or not been that crazy, that he could have understood, he could have contributed to an open source project with his intellect, that he could have disintermediated it with the technology instead of trying to, you know, blow up a bunch of scientists ineffectively, mostly.
Are you essentially saying Bitcoin needs more terrorists, or where are you going there?
I'm saying, Josh, we can take the terrorists and we can turn them into Bitcoiners.
Are terrorists, don't you know? Haven't you heard?
The world.
Bitcoin fixes terrorism. That's the title of this episode.
That's where I was going with that.
Yeah.
Timothy McVeigh would have been a Bitcoiner probably, but without having blown everybody up, of course.
Yeah, I mean, if we can channel those things into productive, like, peaceful revolutions, I think Bitcoin is basically a peaceful revolution. Like, we are building completely peacefully, completely voluntarily, a parallel system. Join us if you like. Don't like?
Yeah.
Don't join. We're not going to force you.
We're not going to physically blow up the banks. We're just going to financially blow up the banks.
It's quite different from the other way around, right? Because, like, if you live in this country, you're forced to use this banking system. And pretty soon you're going to be forced to use digital currency, and you're not going to have cash. And, you know, we're not forcing anybody to do anything. We're just showing them the way. And if they want to join us, great. I hope they do.
I say we pivot to your real passion, which is the tech side of things, here, Jan.
All right.
Let's do two things here. One is, what are you most excited about that's being developed on with Bitcoin? We'll start there. And then I want to pivot into what do you think the biggest technological hurdles are for Bitcoin in the next few years? One of the most exciting companies and projects that Josh and myself, Dan, have come across in the last few years is CrowdHealth. If you're already familiar with CrowdHealth and have interest in checking it out, then use code BLUE for a significant 3-month trial discount. Healthcare is an incredibly confusing, stressful, and cumbersome space to navigate. CrowdHealth provides a remarkable and workable alternative to traditional healthcare setups for a fraction of typical premiums. It's essentially the decentralization of healthcare. You can leverage the power of Bitcoin alongside healthcare crowdfunding to put decisions about your health back in your hands. Each member gets access to great healthcare services as well as their own dedicated care advocate that will negotiate your bills and find members the best doctors and hospitals. Go to joincrowdhealth.com to learn more. And if you're interested in the Bitcoin-specific crowdfund, go to joincrowdhealth.com/Bitcoin. BCB listeners can enjoy healthcare freedom with code BLUE to get your first 3 months for a substantial discount at $99 a month. That is code BLUE. CrowdHealth is not health insurance, which we feel is a wonderful thing. If you have healthcare needs or concerns, seriously, give CrowdHealth a look. The Blue Collar Bitcoin podcast is brought to you by arguably the most legendary company in Bitcoin, CoinKite. They are the producers of the renowned Cold Card, the world's most trusted and secure Bitcoin signing device, built with a plethora of features fit for Bitcoin beginners all the way up to the most advanced of users. This device is a one-stop shop for your Bitcoin custody needs, and something the two of us have trusted for years. CoinKite also manufactures the Block Lock, a gorgeous e-ink digital display art piece sitting in the background of what seems to be every serious Bitcoiner on the planet. Block Lock can be programmed to scroll through key Bitcoin metrics including price, hash rate, next halving date, and much more. Boy oh boy will this thing look good in your living room or office. They are also the makers of many other security and fun products for all users, no matter their technical aptitude. Support our show and get a delicious discount on CoinKite products by following our affiliate link on the screen and in the notes, and using code BCB for 5% off the Cold Card.
So I'll go a little bit parallel on that. I think what's kind of interesting to me is the development of NOSTR and decentralized communications in general. I've been trying this month to be more on NOSTR. It's been kind of hard. It's really hard to pull away from Twitter. It's kind of, there's a lot of momentum there. But, when I grew up, I got internet access in 93 when I was a kid. The first thing, actually, before that, I was on BBSs, which are bulletin board systems for those people who might be younger. Basically, you get a modem, you call into this thing, and you get like this black screen with a bunch of text on it. And you saw like all kinds of crazy shit. Like there was bomb making instructions, there was, porn, like whatever you wanted was on there.
Wait,
right?
How did they display porn with what? With just
it was
text?
like very like
novels?
line by line, like rendering of GIFs. It was like, you're sitting there for like 30 seconds trying to get.
And that is OG.
But like the point is that people were sharing information freely, right? And I happened upon like a bunch of stuff produced by like very early hacker groups. There was like the Loft and the CDC and a bunch of these things, and they were producing all this information, how to do things on the internet, and that's how I learned. Like a lot of my sort of programming background was reading these hacker things and like understanding all these things on these systems. And then I first got access to communication through IRC. Like IRC was Internet Relay Chat. It was peer-to-peer, more or less. It was servers that talked to other servers. There was no central authority. You joined the server would connect to other servers, and they would all relay messages. And you basically had this decentralized communications platform where anybody could chat on any topic, and there's no censorship, there was no organization to it. And that was like amazing, right? Because you went from like just reading this information to actually talking to other people about it, right? And you can just talk on any topic, on anything. And I think we're coming back to that right now. So, we quickly like centralized these, Twitters and Facebooks and Instagrams and everything, centralized our communications. They made it really convenient and really nice and good UI and so on. And so everybody went there. Even though IRC didn't die, it still exists and some people still use it. But by and large, it's like forgotten, right? But I think there's this like NOSTR movement and just in general movements with decentralized communications, with Hole Punch and all this other stuff. We're actually able to come back to a system where, we're truly peer-to-peer communication. But now the missing ingredient is there, which is money. We have peer-to-peer money on a peer-to-peer communications protocol. So now we're talking freely and we're transacting value freely. And that, to me, the marriage of those two things, I think is really exciting. It could really disrupt everything, like no more advertising, no more censorship, pure peer-to-peer communication, value for value, reward people for good work that they do. And that could be really transformative. So really watching that space closely, it's very exciting.
It is.
And I forgot what the other question was.
Before I say that, it feels like, as we've said, decentralization is compounding. And these two protocols sort of, They more than just help each other. They really make the other, especially in the NOSTR use case, like you can really see it getting off the ground because of the monetary incentive. If that's not there, I think NOSTR is nothing close to what it is and has nowhere near the potential. So these things are really starting to wrap together and compound.
Totally. And there was a whole bunch of decentralized communications platforms that are kind of competing. There was like Matrix and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I think you're right in that NOSTR kind of had that spark because of the Bitcoin community latching onto it and starting to build on top of it and being very closely integrated, because now, you know, people are incentivized to produce good content and be rewarded for it financially, which is way better than the advertising model where you're incentivized to produce garbage clickbait and be rewarded for, you know, the most clickbaity possible thing that you could produce and completely distorting people's, you know, reality in the process, which is just terrible.
For sure. The second part of that question was to steel man a little bit here, and we all know Bitcoin's magnificent, but it's not perfect. In your mind, what is the biggest tech hurdle Bitcoin still needs to overcome, or what concerns you about the protocol, and how do you think maybe that could be rectified?
I'm less concerned about the protocol, but I am concerned about like the apps on top of it. I think there's still a large body of work to be done in terms of simplifying the experience. And I'm still on the fence about Lightning. Like, I mean, Lightning's super cool. It's obviously, it's working and so on and so forth. But I still kind of believe that it'll probably end up being an infrastructure layer. I think it's going to be harder for people to run their own nodes, especially like Lightning nodes on things like phones where you don't have consistent uptime, you don't have consistent communications. You get disruption in your network. You've got latency. I think those issues will bite the idea of like completely self-managed nodes, and I think we're going to end up in an infrastructure situation. We'll probably end up building other layers on top of Lightning. Some of the things I'm watching, you know, like the Mint idea, Charmian eCash, which is basically you have yet another layer of people producing tokens that could be settled onto Lightning, but these tokens can be transacted sort of off-chain or off. Now it's not even off-chain; it's now off Lightning, right? It's completely removed one layer. Again, so you have like Fedimint and Cashew that are trying to do stuff like this. I think we haven't seen the full picture yet. I think there might be like 10 layers yet to come that we haven't understood yet. Just like in the financial system, there's 10 layers, right? Like Visa is extremely far from base money, right? But that's what we use day to day. We just swipe our card and things just work. And we don't really think about that there's 10 layers between that and like banks settling with each other, you know, with Swift or Fedwire or whatever. So
yeah, it seems logical that as these layers become, like even Lightning Network eventually fees will, you know, exist, and they'll probably get more expensive as these systems proliferate. It'll make sense for another layer to get made just evolutionarily. Like it's going to happen because it's kind of needed for some reason or another. Yeah. So you don't see, I guess, the way Start 9 has made Bitcoin nodes super simple. Like you just download it, push go, and then you just download whatever specific app, Bitcoin Core, whatever it is. You don't see that becoming Lightning, a Lightning node being that simple?
I see it a little bit. Like I mean, I run an Umbrel, and I agree. Like it took me half an hour to set up Umbrel, but like let's be real. I mean, I had to download a thing, and I had to, you know, plug things together, and it was pretty simple. I am somewhat technical. I don't see my mom doing it. I think it's going to end up with a community model. Like I can run a node for my community, whether that's my family or my extended family or my neighborhood or something. And I think, kind of like what you saw with the internet, right? You have early people, like I had a modem, right? Not everybody around me had a modem. Eventually, some of the people with the modems ended up being the service providers for their neighborhood. Right. They ended up being the early ISPs. I think that most likely scenario is that Lightning is like that. You have LSPs, they become, you know, you're the LSP for your family, for your community, whatever. Sometimes it'll scale much bigger, like you might have like a wallet of Satoshi. That's a huge Lightning provider right now. In fact, I just saw some stats that on NOSTR, like 95% of zaps are going through wallet of Satoshi, which is completely custodial. So on one hand, you might say like, well, shit, that just like completely ruins the idea, right? Like that's now there's no real peer-to-peer transactions. It's all just transactions inside of wallet of Satoshi's database. They're not really Lightning transactions, but they are, because people are able to move them from there elsewhere, right? So the fact that you can still do that is important, not the fact that it is centralized. Yes, it's centralized, but it's very easy to switch and it's a really easy move. So I suspect, you know, obviously nobody can really predict the future, but I suspect that no matter how simple you make node running, the reality is it is a service provider type of thing, because it requires uptime, which most people can't manage. It requires good connectivity, most people can't manage. You know, these things like are just not practical for everyday people to manage, especially not on mobile devices, let alone, something plugged in at home, which mine's plugged in at home and it goes down, once every couple of weeks for whatever reason, right? Like, I don't know. So,
yeah, also liquidity management. Like, we were messing with
Mm-hmm.
managing liquidity on our Lightning nodes. This is probably a year ago. And we were like, yeah, this is tricky.
It's not true.
It took me several hours to get anything moving. Obviously, you can, that's how email was early on and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is worth, like, the beauty of Bitcoin is we're not completely siloed by anything. Like, I know it feels to a lot of people like Lightning's the horse is completely out of the barn. And yeah, there's a lot of energy and effort and excitement around that. But if Lightning isn't the answer, the base layer doesn't give a shit.
Exactly.
Like, someone else can invent something that works better, and there might be another layer too that in 15 years we're like, hey, remember that Lightning thing? I'm not saying that's likely, but that's possible. That's how open source base layers work.
Exactly.
Like this.
And
Nobody knew after TCP/IP where we were going, and here we are streaming HD video. So
it seems like everyone's forgotten about Liquid. That exists on the side too. It doesn't seem like it's being used that much, but it's there. It's an alternative. It's another way to move Bitcoin off chain. It's not completely trustless, but it's a lot more trustless than the financial system we have now. That's for sure.
Yeah, and there might be some interesting use cases. Like, I've heard that they're now using there's this thing called peer swap, which is a peer-to-peer. You can swap like Liquid for Lightning and stuff like that, and people are actually using it to rebalance Lightning channels. I mean, it's just so early. I mean, people in the space here they think like we're pretty deep into this, we're 10 years in or whatever, but like, look how long it took the internet to actually become something like where we could stream video to each other. I mean, we're talking about 40 years. We're not talking about a decade. We're not talking about small amounts of time. And we're extremely early. And yes, it's an exponential trend. It's moving very quickly and it's amplified by the internet, but it does take time to figure out a lot of things. A lot of its usability that it's just gonna sit there, and we'll have whatever the current Lightning experience is for a few years. And then we'll have this like step up leap and, oh my God, we just have a new way of doing things that's way easier.
Sure.
And it'll happen, we just got to give it time to mature and more developers to become aware of it.
We're going to ask you a tough question as a closer here, but I think one that a lot of people wonder and we get questions about. Talk to us about KYC versus non-KYC Bitcoin. I know you get this a lot, but it's I think a good question for us to answer for you at Swan and for us with you guys sponsoring us. What's your take on that, and take that any direction you want?
For sure. I think it's an important question to talk about. I mean, I'm just going to say it on the record. I think KYC AML is a shit law. It's like, I think the Bank Secrecy Act is a shit law. I think the Patriot Act is a shit law. If I was like the lawmaker, I'd go and repeal it, right? I think what these systems do, and there's stats out there, by the way, to prove this, that they create honeypots, A, so that means it's easier for hackers to steal identities. B, they are not effective at stopping crime, really. Like, if you look at the stats, it's like less than 1% of crimes, I think, is being stopped by these sorts of things. What it is doing is it's creating a surveillance state where it's using the banking system as a surveillance arm of the U.S. government without any, probable cause, right? We're just going to surveil every single transaction just in case. I think that's a terrible thing. How do we get out of it? Like, there's two ways, right? One is we change the laws. I just don't see that being realistic. Like, how are you going to undo? This has now been going on for 30, 40 years, right? Bank Secrecy Act, I think, is from the 70s. Patriot Act's from early 2000s. You have entrenched interests now, and also you have industry. You have companies that are literally just there to like make sure that you're compliant with this. You have companies that help you gather that data. You have companies that make sure that you're compliant with that data, and all of them have vested interest in maintaining the system. It's absolutely terrible. So I think if you can get KYC-free Bitcoin, great. You can earn it. That's probably the best way. There's peer-to-peer marketplaces, right? There's like BISC and RoboSats and stuff like that. I will caution that there have been people busted on the seller side of those marketplaces. So because the FinCEN and the governing body that sort of looks over this has said that anybody selling on those marketplaces is a MSB. They're a money services business. If they're in a registered money services business, they're going to get busted. And when they get busted, if they have your records that you've bought from them, the government will know. So I think pretending like peer-to-peer marketplaces are completely safe is an illusion. They're really not. And there are court cases out there and criminal cases out there. So use them, but be aware. Earning,
there's risks there as well.
There's risks.
Yeah.
Earning is also very difficult to do in a KYC free way. I mean, if you're, doing some sort of task over the internet, and you can get paid in sats, like without identity, that's great. If you're in a sort of a business environment, businesses generally have to identify their employees for their own reasons. So it's like very difficult to earn completely KYC free. But if you can do it, great. And I think it's a great democratizing force across the world, especially if you're, in a country that's got a currency problem. Like we have employees in Nigeria and Turkey, they earn Bitcoin, So I think that, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, just one quick follow-up. If you had to choose between, if you were trying to stay relatively anonymous, peer-to-peer, or would you just buy KYC and then coin join it? Which way do you think you're more...
I don't know, man. It's a tough, like I'm not an expert in CoinJoin, and everything I read is like that, this can be de-anonymized, this can be de-anonymized. There's constant attacks on this stuff. I don't know. It's hard to say. Probably CoinJoin is with enough rounds and enough obfuscation and so on is good. But at the end of the day, like if the government really wants to know if you have Bitcoin, they're going to ask you like they do on your IRS form. And if you lie, you're going to go to jail. So like at the end of the day, it's like you can do as much as you want to hide this stuff. But like if somebody really wants to know, they're going to figure it out. So I think to me, the privacy issue is much more about like making Bitcoin sort of acceptable in everyday use. Like when I go to the store and I spend my Bitcoin, I don't want the merchant to know that I have, X amount of Bitcoin at home. Like I don't want to expose my stack, right? So CoinJoin is good for that reason, right? Obfuscating your privacy for spending reasons is really good. As far as hiding from the government, I think that's really tough. Like if the government really wants to, they will find you. So I think people are a little bit under illusion that they're being super stealthy. Did they really make sure that their VPN was on every time? Are they sure the VPN isn't pwned and is being monitored by the CIA or NSA or whatever the hell monitors that?
The CIA probably runs all the VPNs.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like you don't really know. So if they want to know, they'll figure it out. Believe me, right? So I think the law sucks. Let's try to change it. But I think the only way we do it really is to transition to a Bitcoin circular economy, right? So like when I pass away, my kids are going to inherit Bitcoin. It's going to be pretty darn close to KYC free to some degree, right? Like they'll start spending it with other people that want to earn Bitcoin. That's going to be relatively KYC free. And the more that happens and as generations pass, like that whole system just goes away. The whole reason KYC exists is for risk, which doesn't exist in Bitcoin because you don't have reversals. And also because the government like wants to monitor every transaction or whatever. And once it becomes really difficult and they just can't do it, that problem will solve itself. So
that's a great answer, man. Great way to come at it. Like to take over the city, you have to wheel the Trojan horse through the front gates. And that's kind of what you're saying. And I totally agree that I think I am not shitting on non-KYC Bitcoin, but I do think that you shouldn't let the hypothetically perfect be the enemy of good.
Also true.
And I think there, as you articulated extremely well, there's risks on all sides of this. The other thing from our vantage point, once again, hats off to the people that are non-KYCing, but it's not easy to do. Back to making this relatable for average folks. There's hurdles, there's risks. It's even more unknown. Not only are you asking them to buy this crazy internet money that they think is a joke, but to do it in this way that seems really sketchy. So just from like call us, cop-outs and cucks or whatever, but from a tangible standpoint of I
just call it being an adult. Okay, there's trade-offs to everything. That's what an adult understands trade-offs, and kids don't understand trade-offs. And if you want to be like black or white about it, and KYC bad and this good, you can do that. But like keep in mind that many buyers of Bitcoin cannot buy it in a KYC free way. Like
for sure,
corporations, for example, you could say corporations bad. Okay, but like Saylor can't buy his Bitcoin if it's KYC free. It's just not going to happen within the framework and in the place that he lives in the government laws, right? So,
yep.
And some
none of our peers
totally
at the firehouse
some people
are buying
like,
Bitcoin if it's we're not going to get a 47 or a 55-year-old firefighter to buy Bitcoin in a non-KYC manner right now.
But earning, like what I think one thing that is cool is like earning or repay is another really good use case. Like you take your firefighters out for dinner, and they give you cash and you repay them in Bitcoin, or you split the bill, whatever. That's a great time to orange pill people. They get pretty darn close to KYC free stats. Again, I think if you really look at it, somebody could really have you coin joined, that you keep a completely clean trace on those on your online footprint, that you never connect your phone to your carrier so they know who you are and know your IP address. Okay, now they have the data. If you followed everything perfectly and then at least you gave them those KYC free stats, they have now something that's kind of KYC free, sort of. And then when they spend it with somebody else, now it's made one more hop, and now it's a little bit more KYC free. And so again, Bitcoin circular economy, start paying people in Bitcoin, start giving your friends Bitcoin as birthday presents, wedding presents, whatever. Like, convince them to take it. Tip your waitress in Bitcoin if you can. When handy people come to my house, like workers come to my house, somebody's doing plumbing or whatever, I ask them, you want to get paid in Bitcoin? And I ask them like it's normal. I don't ask them, have you heard of Bitcoin? No, I say, do you want to get paid in Bitcoin or cash? Like, I'm fine with paying you in Bitcoin. And if they don't know what that is, then we'll talk about it, So got to normalize it. That's the way we get to the KYC free stuff. But if you want to buy $1 million, I mean, you're going to have to do a KYC. You have to do it on Swan. So sorry, I got to put that shameless plug in there.
Yeah, got to.
Don't feel bad at all.
We will see you. You live really literally right down the street, but we'll see you for sure in California. We'll be at Pacific Bitcoin. I think we're going to maybe be throwing down in the Swan Dome there.
Nice.
We appreciate you folks. Give audience a handoff to anything you want here, and then we'll send you on your merry way into what I'm sure will continue to be a delightfully swamped week at Swan.
Yes, it'll be fun. All right, cheers, guys. Thanks a lot. It was a lot of fun.
Appreciate
Thanks,
you.
John.
Take care.
Bye-bye.